This is the Romantic period in English literature lecture. The dates we are giving this time period for our class is 1785 to 1830. So you should notice there's a few years of overlap with the Enlightenment period. Let's talk about the philosophy from this time period. Romantics believe that the individual or the self is equal to nature, which is equal to God. They believe that humans are perfect and can understand the world and themselves and God by going into nature and doing something like looking at a daffodil or a rainbow or a cloud or something like that. The ideas of primitivism, melancholy, and the power of emotion were very prevalent during this time. Romantics had a great admiration of the child, the innocent, the hermit, and the untamed savage. In other words, people who live close to nature, as well as they also had other romantic tenets. They held to an interesting philosophy. The bottom part of this triangle we'll call the Innocence Stage. This is the world of the child who is natural but knows nothing and does not understand his or her innocence. Then we move into the Experience Stage, which is the world of the adult, of responsibility. This is the world many of you might be in. You're taking on more responsibility. You are worrying about college and paying for it. You're taking AP classes. You have jobs, etc. And then we have that top slice, which is the higher innocence. That's when the adult returns to the beauty of childhood, but now understands what it all means. Okay, that's when he becomes one with all things. He loses his all ego, all self, and in doing so understands nature and self and God. One can reach this place occasionally, but seldom can remain in it, especially when one must return back down to that experience stage, when life's responsibilities of job and family come back in. It's hard to stay in that area of higher innocence. So this is what Romantics held to. This is a widespread philosophy among artists during this time. And so another thing about Romantics is that they sought to find the absolute or the ideal. So you should put an asterisk and write the word ideal. They were always trying to transcend the actual to find the ideal. Whereas maybe in previous generations, like the neoclassicists, they found values in scientific law and reason. Romantics want to find truth. They want to find the ideal through different means. We're going to talk about that some more. William Wordsworth was a premier romantic poet. This is one of his poems, My Heart Leaps Up. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. So already we can see almost every element of romantic philosophy or style or subject in this one poem. And so I want you to keep this poem in mind as we go through the rest of this lecture. And we'll return to it later. So just to give you a little bit of context about the social and political climate during this time, we're going to focus on England, but a lot of these same things were happening in America a little bit later. So England was an agricultural society with a powerful landholding aristocracy, but it was now giving way to a modern industrial nation of large-scale employers and a growing, restless middle class. The American and French revolutions were hugely important elements of the political landscape. Threats to existing social structure were being posed by new revolutionary ideas. This was also a time of harsh political repression in England, in spite of need for changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution. So a side effect of the Industrial Revolution was this great time of change. Okay, so mill towns were growing. The landscape was increasingly subdivided. Factories spewed pollution over slums, and the population was increasingly divided into rich and poor. Reforms didn't occur because of the philosophy of laissez-faire, which means let alone. That philosophy prevailed, so reforms couldn't happen under that type of climate. Consequences of that were low wages, horrible working conditions, large-scale employment of women and children, and brutally harsh conditions such as coal mining. So in the face of this type of poverty and the issues that workers had, they couldn't vote, and they had to resort to protests and riots, which in turn incurred further repression. So while the poor suffered, the leisure class prospered. Again, that division of rich and poor was becoming vaster. Just a small note on the plight of women during this time. Women of all classes were regarded as inferior to men, were undereducated, had few legal rights, and in spite of all those things, the cause of women's rights was still largely ignored. And this was something that did not get addressed until later eras. So when we get into Victorian and modern eras, we'll see more of this issue come to light. But that is just for you to know as you read some works to understand where the women were at this time. It's really hard to define Romanticism, and it's defined differently by a lot of people. But we're going to focus in on a few things in the rest of this lecture. Romantic writers had this sense of the spirit of the age. So they took what was going on in their environment and their culture and society and took it in and made this great art out of it. So they took what was going on in their age and they had a spirit about it, and they wrote about it, and they painted about it, and wrote music about it. Anytime you've got war and revolutions and social change, there will be great outpouring of art and literature. It happens in every era of history. And so the Romantic era was one especially where we see a great change. It was a great reaction against the Enlightenment. And so writers had a great release of creative energy, and it was seen as an age of new beginnings and limitless possibilities. Compare that with the Enlightenment. Let's hone in on poetic theory and practice. Poetry was seen as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The essence of poetry was the mind, emotions, and imagination of the poet, not the outer world. Of great importance is the emergence of the first-person lyric poem. It became a major Romantic literary form, with I often referring directly back to the poet. So these were becoming very personal poems as they used the word I. And again, this goes back to individualism that we talked about at the very beginning of the lecture. Romantics see the individual at the center of all life, and it places the individual, therefore, at the center of art, making literature valuable as an expression of unique feelings and particular attitudes, and valuing its fidelity in portraying experiences, however fragmented or incomplete, more than it values adherence to completeness, unity, or the demands of the genre. Poets often saw themselves as prophets in a time of crisis. So in their changing social and political climate, poets found themselves as a voice in the midst of those things as they tried to transcend to the ideal. They also believed that poetic composition must arise from impulse, that it must be free from the rules inherited from the past, and it must rely on instinct, intuition, and feeling. Poets dropped the conventional poetic diction in favor of fresher language and bolder figures. And a lot of times you'll see poets use this language of the common man. They were fascinated with country folk and sometimes children and different people. So they would incorporate this type of language into their poems, They just found it interesting. They were fascinated by common, ordinary people. There was an importance on nature in poems. Poets emphasized the importance of accurate observation and description of wild nature. They believed that that stimulated thinking, that nature could help resolve personal problems and crises. We'll often see a landscape given human qualities. And Romantics believe that our closeness to nature brings out our innate goodness. Again, they thought that mankind was perfect and good, and being close to nature would really be a catalyst for us becoming good. Nature was seen as a healing power and often as a refuge from the artificial constructs of civilization, including artificial language. Romantics were fascinated with the supernatural and the strange. Many Romantic poems explore the realm of mystery and magic. They incorporate materials from folklore and superstition. A lot of literature is set in distant or faraway places. And related to that, the Romantics had a renewed interest in the Middle Ages as they believed it was a beautiful, exotic, mysterious, bygone era. So you'll see lots of references and allusions to that. And in bringing back the ballad form, you'll see that in a lot of Romantic pieces. And there was also a great interest in unusual modes of experience, such as visionary states of consciousness, hypnotism, dreams, drug-induced states, etc. So some of those things are really interesting to read. There's this idea of the glorification of the commonplace that we see in a lot of Romantic literature. There's usually a humble, rustic subject matter, and a plain style became the principal subject and medium of poetry. And poets really sought to refresh readers' sense of wonder about the ordinary things of existence, to make the old world seem new. Back to this idea of individualism. Human beings were seen as essentially noble and good, though they're corrupted by society. And they were seen by Romantics as possessing great power and potential that have formerly been ascribed only to God. There was a belief in democratic ideals, concern for human liberty, and there was a great outcry against various forms of tyranny. The human mind, according to a Romantic, was able to create, at least partly, the world around it. And as having access to the infinite via the faculty of imagination. Think about that. Romantics believed that your imagination could create the world around you. Romantics, refusing to accept limitations, believed that human beings set infinite and accessible goals, thus making failure and imperfection glorious accomplishments. And this refusal to accept limitations found expression in bold, poetic experimentation. They wrote some very bold, out-of-the-box poems. And many writers deliberately isolated themselves from society to focus on their individual vision. So that theme of exile is very common, with the Romantic nonconformist often seen as a great sinner or outlaw. The imagination was elevated to a position as the supreme faculty of the mind. The Romantics tended to define and to present the imagination as our ultimate shaping or creative power. So it shapes individuals. The imagination is the approximate human equivalent of the creative powers of nature or even deity. So imagination had great power during this time. It could create the world around you. Some big names during this time: William Wordsworth, Mary Shelley, John Keats, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Lord Byron, among others. So let's talk about some questions. explain in complete sentences 3 differences between the Enlightenment and the Romantic eras. Question 2. Explain the ways the Wordsworth poem displays romantic ideals. And there's the poem again for you. We're revisiting it. 3. Why do you think Romantic writers did not use traditional form in poetry? What was the reason behind that? And at number 4, I want you to make connections between the cultural and political climates and the philosophy of Romanticism. In other words, what events or changes during this time affected the beliefs and art of the people?